Alright, welcome back. So in this video, we're now going to move on to chapter 5, and we're going to talk about negative entities, right? So, not the best topic in the world, but still very, very important to talk about. So like I said in the last video, we went over the spirituality, so we talked about a lot about the spirit realm in terms of your connection to God. Still more we got, like I keep saying, right? So there's still more we got to talk about in chapter 10. But as you can see, everything in the spirit realm on the positive side revolves around God. I know I keep talking like a Christian. Originally, I wasn't really meaning to talk about this stuff from a Christian perspective, but it just kind of ended up that way. Like I said, I see it more in metaphysics rather than religion, but I'll just kind of continue and say that everything in the spirit realm on the positive side revolves around God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. Now we're going to talk about the negative side of things, which has to do with negative entities. So, and again, that's very, very, very important in terms of understanding the world around us and the things that go on. So we mostly talked about how things kind of go south when God's Spirit moves out of your life, but we didn't really talk very much about what happens at that point, right? And that's basically these guys move in, right? And they make everything sort of crap. So that's why it's important to still talk about it, even though it's very, very negative. So to go over this first point, negative entities or demons, right? So these are just what most people would call demons, right? So I just call them negative entities. I feel like I'm charging less negative energy when I say that, word it that way. But so negative entities are metaphysical beings that have little to no spiritual energy and thus can only charge negative frequencies. Excuse me. So like I said, so these are basically beings. So you can use different sort of theologies to kind of talk about what they are, where they came from. In the Bible, they would be fallen angels, right? But I've also seen, I don't know, I guess aliens, gray aliens. So I don't know. I consider them to be negative entities as well. I'll talk a tiny bit about them later. But yeah, whoever they are, wherever they came from, these are beings that have either little spiritual energy or no spiritual energy at all. And what that ultimately means is that their connection to God they're as far from God as you can be, right? So remember, spiritual energy is basically a measure of your connection to God. And as you connect to God more and more, your ability to feel all positive frequencies increases. As you move away from God, your ability to feel all negative frequencies increases, and your ability to feel positive frequencies decreases. And I should have said before, as you move closer to God, your ability to feel negative frequencies or charge them decreases as well. So it's the opposite. And so, presumably, if you have no spiritual energy, you can't feel any positive frequency, and you can only charge negative frequencies. So that's how they are, right? I don't know if there are beings who who aren't in a position where they have no spiritual energy, but there might be some that just have very little, right? They might ostensibly be able to feel some positive emotion, but mostly they feel negative emotions. So yeah, these are very negative beings, obviously, and they exist in the spirit realm. As far as I know, they don't have physical bodies or anything, but they do exist in the spirit realm. I believe they still have a conscious mind and subconscious mind, and they have a spiritual body, and their subconscious works virtually the same as ours, except they can't charge any positive emotions, right? They can't charge up at any positive frequencies. So basically the opposite of angels and guides. To go over this point, which is just really an extension of this one, due to the absence of spiritual energy, their appearance reflects deeply negative organizational patterns, which is just a fancy way of saying that the way they look, the way they sound, the way they behave, the beliefs they have are all extremely negative, right? So very hateful, angry. They do not feel sympathy for anyone because that's a positive frequency, right? So they have no sympathy. They have apathy. The way they look, right? They look their look has a what God has determined is a negative organizational pattern. So they look like monsters, zombies, just pure evil, dark, right? a very dark appearance, disposition, their behavior, right? Very conniving. Now, knowledge itself, so I should mention this, that knowledge is not considered to be associated with a frequency, right? So they can still have intelligence, but they use their intelligence to calculate, for basically calculations in ways that are very deviant, right? So they try to trick you. They try to basically their goal is for you to move away from God, right? Which we'll talk more about that a little later. Yeah, actually, should have mentioned in this video. So their number one goal. Oh yeah. I was thinking about when I talk about it. I talk about it more. We're going to talk about spiritual attacks and what those are. At least that's when I talk about in the book. But suffice it to say, these guys hate us, and their number one goal is to separate us from God. So they use their transcendental. Well, it's not really transcendental intelligence for them, but they use their intelligence to calculate ways to get you to move away from God. It's pretty much what they're always doing. And of course, they have transcendental beliefs where they hate everyone, see all of us as pieces of crap, right? And they don't like us. So those are all the ways that their subconscious would reflect a negative organizational pattern, right? Even these sounds, some people are able to hear what they sound like. Sometimes that happens, right, in dreams and things like that. And their sound is very monstrous, right? That's a negative reflection of a negative organizational pattern. So, to go to this next point, normally negative entities are unable to significantly interact with us beyond relatively minor influences. So people are, the thing about us that's very interesting in terms of the spirit realm, and we talked about it before, so I said the spirit realm is bifurcated, right? So it goes very, very, very positive, and then it could go very, very, very negative, right? Excuse me. And you can generally go one direction and not both. Now, people, what makes us interesting is that we're in a very special state, right? So our body has life in it from God's Spirit, and that life is associated with God's grace. Now, during that time where we have God's grace, we can kind of go back and forth, right? So we can go negative or positive. Really what we can do is sin and not sin. But not every negative emotion or frequency is necessarily sinful. But just to kind of make it more simple, we can charge at a negative frequency, or we could charge up at a positive frequency or a negative frequency, right? Now, in the spirit realm, I think that's a little bit unusual, right? Because normally, if you're in heaven, you could go you're just all positive, and maybe you could go more and more positive, depending on. Some people say there are different levels to heaven. That was actually alluded to in a near-death experience. One of the ones I talked about, I just forgot the name, but I did mention it. I forgot which video that was. I think it was in the video when I was talking about honesty. No, I was talking about. Actually, I think it was chapter 3 when I was talking about how a selfish intention can look. No, I think I did talk about it in last chapter. It was one of them. It was about how a selfish intention it can look good on the outside but be selfish on the inside. It was either chapter 3 when I was talking about the spiritual trade-off effect, or chapter 4 was talking about honesty. It was one of them. But I mentioned the guy's name. So he kind of alluded to this idea because he had a near-death experience. And it was a hellish near-death experience. Jesus saved him. And Jesus mentioned how because he was only really serving God and serving Jesus out of selfishness, right, he would be like on the lowest level, right, of heaven. I believe basically it was something to that effect. And so there may be different levels to heaven. And in the spirit realm, as you go higher and higher, you have more and more positivity and more spiritual energy. I think you're locked in that state. But what makes us very interesting is we can go both directions, right? Really, in terms of sin or immoral behaviors and moral behaviors, or negative frequencies and positive frequencies. Now, because of that, we have the ability to increase our spiritual energy, so we connect more and more and more with positive beings, but we can also make our energy more negative. And now when our energy becomes more negative, looking at something real quick. Yeah, so when our energy becomes more negative, they're able to basically interact with us more, which actually I wanted to get to here. Now here I'd say that they can they're unable to really interact with us beyond relatively minor influences. And the minor influences that I'm talking about, I'll talk more about later. Basically, they can plant suggestions in your subconscious, which can cause you to be more tempted, or they can plant suggestions in your subconscious, which confuse you, right? That's basically what they do, but it's not very strong, right? Unless you do certain things. And so that part is always going to be around, their ability to do that, but when you have a strong relationship with God, especially when you understand how all this stuff works, then that doesn't really do much. But what I like to say, what I was kind of saying in the book, is negative entities, they don't have physical bodies, so they're in the spirit realm. Now, our psychic abilities are generally turned off, so we're unable to sense them. Our physical senses aren't able to sense them. So that's a great thing. So I like to compare them to someone who's constantly trying to annoy you, but you're just ignoring them, right? But, so you're basically ignoring them because you can't sense them. So even though they want to annoy you, they want to annoy you, they can't because you're unable to sense them generally. But there are circumstances when your ability to sense them or perceive them increases. Now they can really annoy you and harass you and do certain things, and that really gets to what I want to talk about here. So, when spiritual energy drops to very low levels, you increase your transcendental connection to all beings who exist in the section of the spirit realm who have little to no spiritual energy, right? So this is really consequential. So we talked about in the chapter 3, I believe, that I talked about how reality was bifurcated and how you have a transcendental connection to everybody in the universe, right? Negative or positive. And you can increase that connection, right? Or decrease that connection. You can increase it to certain sections of the metaphysical realms and things like that. Now, all the positive realms just get closer and closer and closer to God, right? God's the North Star. Now, as you move away from God, then you're increasing your connection to all the beings in the negative part of the metaphysical realms, right? So those are your negative entities, which that you generally do through sin, right? Sin pushes away your spiritual energy, right? Again, a negative emotion doesn't necessarily do it alone, but sin does. And we're going to talk more about it in the next video, but if you really sort of give into a negative emotion and charge it, then it does become sinful. Then it'll push spiritual energy away. But, so we'll talk about that next video. But suffice it to say, when you continuously engage in sin, you lose more and more and more spiritual energy, and thus your connection to those, to the section of reality who have no spiritual energy or have very little, you increase your transcendental connection to them, right? And that is not good at all, right? Because when you increase your connection to positive entities, they all demonstrate positive qualities. So they respect your free will. They're not overbearing, right? It's a good thing to be connected to them. Negative entities could not care less, right, about your free will. They're not gentle. They have absolutely no interest in doing things in a way that you're comfortable with. They don't care at all, right? So if you increase your connection to them, they're going to be very, very forceful, right? They're going to force their way into your life, do things against your will, do things in a very just overall negative way. Angry, mean, uncomfortable. So basically moving away from God is like losing your protection from them. But really all of this happens in accord with your choice, right? That's pretty much the law of the universe, it's the law of free will, right? So again, it's just when you connect to these beings, when you connect to positive beings, it's really no different than connecting to these beings in the sense of what they're able to do to you. It's just positive beings are just more respectful, right? You don't get to those frequencies unless you respect others and their sovereignty and their free will. So it's great. It's no issue to be connected to those beings. The negative beings don't care about your free will at all, right? So when you connect to them, it's a very uncomfortable negative experience, and they completely violate your free will and your sovereignty and things like that. So you don't want that to happen, but ultimately that's what we're going to talk about in this chapter, how that happens and kind of some of the things that will occur when it happens. So these kind of paradigm I like to set up, which I don't think I mentioned it in the beginning of the video, is this concept of a subconscious infection, right? So this, your subconscious is it's actually possible for your subconscious to become infected, right? And we're going to talk about it here. So it's possible for your subconscious to experience a disease-like state that indicates an infection. When that infection reaches a particular state of virulency, right, then it becomes what is colloquially referred to as possession, right? So you see the term possession in Hollywood movies where someone's possessed and they're kind of screaming and their eyes go back in the head. There are people who do engage in exorcisms and things like that. So I don't know if it ever gets that bad. What I will say is that it is possible for your subconscious to experience something like a disease, right? And that disease, of course, comes from negative entities. So when a negative entity connects to you, and they're always trying to, right? But the spiritual energy pushes them back, right? Keeps them away. But when your spiritual energy drops to really low levels, right? They can increase their connection to you. And at certain moments, it's like they're trying to increase their connection, and boom, like a connection is made, like a strong connection. We'll talk more about that in the next video. But when that happens, now they're planting suggestions in your subconscious, and they're influencing you in certain ways to cause you to sin more and more and act in ways that deviate from God's nature and the nature of Jesus, right? The behavior and the likeness of Jesus Christ. And so when that happens, that's basically like an infection, right? So it's very similar to bacteria, right? So our bodies get certain pathogens, basically. So bacteria, could be fungus, could be viruses, right? They infect our body and cause our body to function in ways it's not supposed to, right? Or prevent it from functioning in the ways it's supposed to. And that causes all kinds of problems for our being alive, right? So in order for our body to sustain life, right, it has an ideal way it's supposed to operate. Your subconscious is basically the same way, right? Your subconscious has an ideal way which it operates, which happens when you increase your connection to God, right? It operates in that, well, really, technically, it always operates the way it's supposed to, right? Which is according to frequencies and expressing itself. Your subconscious instinct expresses itself the way it's supposed to in accord with the frequency and in accord with your free will. But if we were to talk about it in terms of health, right, then it functions more healthily, right, when you increase your connection to God. But as your connection to God decreases, or you connect more to the negative part of reality, of the metaphysical realm, then it functions in a way that's like a diseased state, right? And that can cause, when your subconscious is infected in that way, it can cause disease like, what's the word I want to use? It can cause a diseased like behavior, right, in your subconscious, which will manifest itself in terms of your mental health, in terms of your spiritual health, which is really just means your connection to God, in terms of your physical health and emotional health, right? So all of these things will deteriorate because of a subconscious infection, right? And that's basically occurs when these things latch onto your subconscious. And so it's very similar to a physical infection, right? So actually there's one other thing. Yeah, so when your body basically can get an infection in different ways, right? So it can come in, I think it was four main ways that they generally classify it into, which is, I think, through your mouth or through eating food. It can occur through your skin or sexually transmitted diseases or blood or something. It's something like that, right? So it's, I believe I read it was like four main ways, but whatever the case, they can get into your body in different ways. But they do need some mode of entrance, right? So they have to enter your body in a certain way before they can cause all types of damage. So your subconscious is very similar. There are different ways these negative entities can latch onto your subconscious. So I've broken it down into two main ways, which we're going to talk about in the next couple videos, right? So it's emotionally and psychically. So we're going to talk about that later. Now, so when they latch onto your subconscious, you basically have an infection. Now that infection can grow, right? Like any infection in the body, right? It can get stronger and stronger. When you have an infection in the body, the immune system tries to fight it off and sort of kill it and quell it so it doesn't grow and your body functions normally again. But if something goes wrong and your body doesn't fight the infection gets stronger and stronger, and eventually it'll kill you, right? If your body doesn't fight it. Basically, it's the same thing with a subconscious infection. That infection has the ability to grow and grow. Now, if you don't fight it through your free will, now on the positive side and on God's side, they operate according to your free will, right? So if you don't ask for their help in fighting this infection, right, they're not really going to help you much. They might still, what God will do is something that's related to grace, right? Because you always have His grace. So He may warn you, right? We basically talked about that before, about warning visions. He'll give you some vision or some warning to let you know that the key to avoiding this and getting out of this situation is to ask Him for help, to call out to Jesus, right? He may not always give that to you until you're really deep into it, especially until your spiritual drive kicks into overdrive, because that's going to be when the evil in your life is the most clear, and then you can really come to Jesus Christ. So sometimes He'll wait. Some people get the message from God early. This a lot of times will happen when they're going into witchcraft and things like that. They talk to spirit guides when they talk to negative entities. We'll talk more about that later. Sometimes they'll get that warning message early. Sometimes they get it when they're very deep into it. Basically, God knows the best time to do it. But yeah, they respect your free will. So if you're not making an effort to go to God, then you don't get that help in fighting these things off. I mean, it's really occurring with your free will anyway. But when you go deeper and deeper into darkness and that infection grows more and more, then you have a full-blown possession. So that's how I like to think of it. It starts as an infection, the infection's weak, and when it grows, then it becomes what we call a possession. So kind of similar, not exactly the same, but similar to the difference between HIV and AIDS, right? So when you get HIV, it's just an infection, completely damages your immune system, and as it grows more and more, the impact of that damage turns into AIDS, right? So possession is to AIDS what in subconscious infection is to HIV. So yeah, that's basically the beginning of the discussion. That's basically a paradigm that I like to think of it as, and the framework I like to think of it as with negative entities. So again, this is basically a sickness at the subconscious level, and that sickness manifests itself in people's behaviors, and you'll see it all the time. We'll talk more about it later. We'll see how these behaviors manifest when basically people will just behave in ways, they'll behave and think in ways that are opposite the nature of Jesus, right? So they become more violent, more hateful, more lustful, more full of pride. Sometimes they won't become more... we'll actually talk about it more, because that actually has to do with the first level of possession, which is emotion. But if that infection grows more and more, right, you start to see the effect in the body. The body can start to deteriorate, all kinds of things, because your subconscious is going to more and more and more of a negative frequency, which impacts the body we talked about how the body will change for a prolonged charge, right? If that prolonged charge is negative, it's going to cause negative changes in the body, which we normally call stress. So very bad things, basically only bad things happen when you have a subconscious infection and it grows, right? So in the next video, we're going to talk about emotional possession, right? Which are one of the ways your subconscious can become infected and that infection can grow. That's it for now, though. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.